hope all of you are well. So this morning we're going to do something a little bit different. It's echoing. So we're going to do something a little bit different. And I have my good friend, Xenia Chan, with us. And Xenia is a soon-to-be professor of Old Testament and is currently finishing her PhD studies. And so we asked you to send us questions about the Old Testament, if you had questions or things that you've been wondering about. And we got a few questions, and her and I came up with a few, and so we're going to talk through them. And hopefully you learned something. And hopefully you have a great opportunity to engage. So let's welcome Xenia this morning. What's kind of interesting is this is the first time Xenia and I have ever met in person. We were on a task force together. Sounds really impressive, doesn't it? I led a task force. So anyway, these are things you add to your resume when you want people to think you're better than you are. But so her and I were on a task force together. We have lots of mutual friends also, which I mostly met during COVID, so we all met online. And she's a part of the Free Methodist Church. And so I just want you to tell us a little bit about your specific area of study and kind of what has intrigued you to study the Old Testament.
As you can tell, it's been a long time since I've been in a church with a mic. As I was telling Keitha, it's an interesting story, and I like to embellish my story with humor, so I hope you laugh. But I didn't mean to. I was working with campus ministry, and I had a South Sudanese student say to me in 2016, 2017, he said, "So how do you know that what you're telling me isn't the white man's gospel?" And I thought, oh dear, I don't know that. So I went back to school. And when I was there, I thought, okay, I'll study the New Testament. I've always loved the New Testament. My favorite gospel is the book of Luke, or the Gospel of Luke. But my first semester, I took Hebrew, which nobody ever does because that's a silly thing to do. And I took Intro to Old Testament. And I fell in love because I found in the Old Testament was different stories about who God was and who God is, and I could relate to the things that I was reading. But reading the Old Testament in Hebrew is also more fun than it is in English, because there are things.
Newsflash, reading in the original languages is more fun.
I'm just saying, like, in the Genesis narrative, the first one, in the Hebrew, it says the birds were birding, and you don't get that sort of alliteration that happens in the text in English, right? And then Leviticus, there's all sorts of nifty little things. I don't know how many of you have tried to read through the Bible, and then you get stuck at Leviticus or Numbers, and then you give up. It's more fun in Hebrew. So that's why I did it. But the other thing is that the more I got into it, the more I thought, the story of God, we only ever hear we get snatches and little bits and pieces from the Old Testament, but we don't understand it. And then when we are told to live out what the gospel is, we don't think about the gospel in terms of the Old Testament. And so a lot of times I was really thinking through, what does the life of the church look like when we bring all of the Bible into conversation with our lives, as opposed to just little bits and pieces everywhere? But then, and I've probably told you this, but I fell in love with Jeremiah, which is an insane thing to do because Jeremiah is the weeping prophet. And I think John Calvin calls him, like his book, this like outburst of emotionality, inappropriate emotionality. So that's what I.
That's why we're not Calvinists, okay?
Look, say what you will about Calvin, he was a great exegete. So there was this, and so I spend all of my time in the most emotional passages in Jeremiah, and these are called the Confessions. Jeremiah rails against God, he rails against people, he asks for them to die, he asks for God to give up on him, and then he says at the end of the Confessions, why was I even born? And I'm like, yes, what angst, how amazing. But the thing about the Confessions was that it opened up realization for me in thinking about what the Canadian church looked like and how often people are blind to what God is doing, for good or for ill. And Jeremiah says, enough, like that's it. And how many of us are standing in the gap being like, okay, enough is enough. And so in a lot of ways, that's why I'm doing. Usually I'll say to people, yes, so my PhD dissertation, all 80,000 words of it, is going to be all of my pastoral angst of having been a church planter and a pastor. But that's not really quite true.
Oh, the angst of a pastor. Sounds like a blog. So we've broken this up into longer questions and a speed round. So this is the speed round. And, you know, when you ask academics if they can do a speed round, you get like a bit of anxiety. What? You cannot answer these questions quickly. But today I'm going to push you, and we are going to work at answering them very quickly. So the first one, who are the sons of Nephilim mentioned in Genesis 6, 1 through 4?
Okay, so...
Easy.
So easy. Let's start with the easy ones. Usually it's translated as giants. Nobody actually knows who they are. Our accounts of what the Nephilim are come out of the book of Enoch and Job-ish. They're the produce of hypothetically fallen angels and human offspring is what Enoch and Jubilees, actually, not Job, it's Jubilees, says. But they're apocryphal books. But Calvin, Augustine, and Chrysostom, I can never pronounce that name. John, anyways, I read his... Thank you, Chrysostom. I read his paschal homily every Easter, so I should know how to pronounce that name. Think that angels are from the lineage of Seth, like the men from the lineage of Seth, and so therefore are called the sons of God. And so anyways, nobody knows.
All right, so thanks. Nobody knows. All right. So why did firstborn sons inherit everything? Was this man-made or God commanded?
So the easy answer to that is that the Old Testament paints a very complex picture, as it does for most things. In the story of Ishmael and Isaac, Isaac is the second son. Isaac inherits. In the story of Jacob and Esau, Jacob is given the birthright by way of trickery. When we think about the story of David, David is the last son. And so it's complicated. What things are written are not always the things that are.
So a combination kind of story? All right, just like whatever. If you need an answer. All right. What do we do with the walls of Jericho crumbling with the sound of a trumpet? Is this archaeologically accurate, and is there a point to that story?
I told Keith that this was a can of worms, because archaeology is a can of worms. So there's no, I've been to Jericho. I was in Jericho last summer. And there's a wall. There are walls. But no, we don't think that there was ever a fall of the walls in that precise sort of way. What's really interesting, that story is like in Joshua, which is one of the conquest narratives. And when we think about Jericho, really it's the story of Rahab and her family. Are we doing a conquest?
Just go for it.
We had a conversation, and then these questions emerged out of our conversation. So we're not having the same conversation as our pre-run. So the conquest narrative is really interesting because we know that it's been used to justify all sorts of atrocities in our modern world. And the one that's closest to home is what the church did with indigenous peoples. But it's also laid the groundwork for things like manifest destiny and so on and so forth, and colonialism. Okay, well, that was lovely. But what's really interesting is, like everything else in the Old Testament, we tend to cherry pick. And what we don't realize about the conquest is that there are several narratives of conquest and how they're dealt with. So there's like the one where where annihilation is asked for, one where there's people are driven out by Adonai, by God. Then there's silence. So, for instance, the Book of Chronicles, which is a parallel history to Joshua, Judges, etc., Samuel, Kings, doesn't talk about it because the emphasis in Chronicles is that they were always in the land. And then there's the one where there's an interesting part where I don't remember where this is. I should know where this is. But there's a part where the conquest narrative actually talks about the land vomiting out the inhabitants of the land. And it's sort of a prelude to the Babylonian exile, where the Jewish people are vomited out of the land because of their sin. A friend of mine talks a lot about how the 400 years, like if you read in Genesis, when God is talking to Abraham, it says that the Israelites will be in Egypt for 400 years, and my friend sees this as a grace. There's a grace to Canaanite peoples, that God is trying to bring them back into relationship with him, giving them opportunity to repent. And that's what the 400 years in Israel, that Israel was in Egypt for. And so when we talk about the specific narrative of Jericho, the narrative that I want to come to about the conquest is that the one that we almost never talk about is the one of inclusion. That Rahab's family becomes part of the worshiping people of God and becomes part of the family of God. And Rahab ends up in David's lineage. The other thing, and Rahab isn't the exception. We get the Gibeonites as well. They're kind of adopted in that narrative. But it sets up this stage for the redemption of the nations that we are later told about in Isaiah. That was a very long answer. I'm so sorry.
For the speed round.
Yeah, sorry.
All right, so let's dive into that idea. So we have something like Jericho, and the book of Joshua, which most of us were taught in Sunday school with a lot of fanfare and jubilation about a lot of people being slaughtered and taken over. And we celebrated that. But sometimes, I guess there's two parts to this kind of follow-up. One is, how do we kind of walk through the violence? And secondly, is everything that we're reading factual, or is some of it around building narrative? That was a very leading question.
She wants me to talk about the modernist fundamentalist controversy.
Maybe. I don't know.
So
I don't know what that is.
what do you mean you don't know what that is?
I don't know. Maybe as you go on, I will.
This is my soapbox. So our understanding of truth, of fact, of reality, those things shifted in very specific ways in the modern era. And they were particularly based on Greek and Roman things and understandings. And so our understandings of truth, of narrative, of fact, things that are told in the story are no less true than what we can feel or touch and measure. And okay, I will say this. So the modernist turn in biblical studies, for instance, had people trying to dissect every little inch, jot and tittle of the text. So what this means is that, has anybody heard of Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis? Yeah, great. So JEDP, he says, so the Bible can be separated in these ways. There's the J layer, there's the E layer, there's the D layer, and there's the P layer. Well, the Bible's actually not that easily categorized, right? So a lot of Wellhausen now has been debunked. Most scholars will say, well, yes, the D and P, sure, we can see bits and glimpses of that. By D, the Deuteronomist, the P, priestly. And so when we talk about, and so when they were measuring, they were like, well, we can determine for a fact that this particular layer was written here, and these are the reasons why. But as you start to get into it, you realize that it gets more and more complicated. And how this shows up in Jeremiah, for instance, is that there is really no way to tell who Jeremiah is. We are told that there's a story of the prophet. We are built a very specific narrative of the prophet. We think that we know this prophet well because of the interior life that we are given about him, that we are given about no one else. But in terms of, like, is there a historical Jeremiah? Well, probably at one point. How many editors were involved in the process of putting this book together? We don't know. There are parts of the book, there's one verse in Jeremiah that's written in Aramaic. There are loan words that tell us that parts of it were written much later, but also much earlier. Parts of the book were probably written in the 6th century. And Isaiah, probably parts of it was written in the 6th century. But also there are parts of those books that have loan words from Persia, as opposed to Ugaritic. And then also there's Akkadian, which is Babylonian. And so when it comes to facts, I hold that with quite a grain of salt because we just don't know. I also can't even tell you what I had for breakfast this morning. So, but I think I went on a tangent, which means that I actually forgot the first part of the question.
Well, so one of the things that I'm curious about is the notion of myth and embellishment that is built into the text with good purpose.
Right. Okay. In Joel, it talks about the nations being gathered in the Kidron Valley. This last summer, I walked across the Kidron Valley in 45 minutes. Slowly. Because I walk slow. But it's a very, very small valley. If you take it, it at face value that Solomon had 2,000 wives, well, that would fill all of Jerusalem. That would be all of Jerusalem. He could not have had that many people. And so it's just part of the culture that there is a little bit of embellishment, there is a little bit of a flair to the story. And that's just part of the culture.
Does that take away from the modern church taking the Old Testament seriously?
Define seriously.
You define seriously.
This happens all the time. I toss it back, she tosses it back. Okay, so let me tell you about the story of Marcion, the heretic, where Marcionism comes from. Marcion says if you take the sensus literalis of the text, there's no point in having the Old Testament, which is a very common sentiment in our day and age. My favorite one is Andy Stanley saying, we are going to unhitch the Old Testament because it has no use. The early church fathers and mothers, their solution for this was to read the text allegorically, which is really interesting if you ever want to read Aquinas or Augustine or any of them in how they understand the text. It's a very figural, typological sort of reading. I think there's a way in which taking the Old Testament seriously today looks a little bit like integrating scholarship thinking through, okay, I'm going to sidebar this. For me, the Old Testament tells the story of God and God's relationship with people and creation. And so for me, when I hear that question, do I take seriously the relationship between God and his people and creation? And for me, the answer is yes. And the lovely thing about the Old Testament is the diversity of voices. So for almost every instance of life, you can find something that speaks to that particular instance of time and space. So when it comes down to, do we take things literally? Like, are we talking about Guardians of the Galaxy Drax? Literally, where things like go over his head, and he's like, what's the thing that nothing goes over my head? I don't actually know what that quote is. No, we don't, because we speak in metaphor. We speak with analogies. That happens in everyday parlance and conversation. And so it is with this text. Why do we demand of the text something that's not actually there? When we talk about the picture of God, can we let the text speak for itself as opposed to imposing modern day sensibilities upon the text? So Marcion. Tertullian and Irenaeus, who I love Irenaeus, we can talk about that later, but said, well, actually, you've missed the point, Marcion. You've missed the point of the Old Testament. Marcion cut my favorite gospel. He was like, only this section of Luke is good for the church. I profoundly disagree. And so Marcion was told, your opinion does not stand within the church because your way leads to death. And this actually emerges out of several councils. Like, we have the Old Testament and the New Testament as the Bible. The canon is closed. So we have a closed canon from Genesis to Revelation by the 300s. And this comes out of the councils of Carthage, the Synod of Hippo, and then finally ratified by the Council of Trent. And so what we miss about the canonization of the Bible is that it emerges from North Africa. And so when we think about the ways in which Scripture works in place and time, and how tradition passes on the text, the church believes in the Old Testament because we believe it is part of our Holy Scriptures, because of the way that God has worked through the church through time and space. And we recognize the authority of the church and its traditions. Now, Protestants, I can go on a spiel about Martin Luther, but maybe I shouldn't. We should just go to the next question.
Okay, so, there's a train of thought that says if you study Scripture from a scholarly perspective, you actually, right, like that's dangerous, right? Like and that is often noted in conservative evangelical seminaries, that if you question, if you ask, if you study, you actually are moving people away from God and moving people away from the text rather than towards God and towards the text. So talk to me about the role of the Spirit, and if you can go a little bit deeper into the point of Scripture.
So that's like 5 questions.
Sure.
Okay, I'm gonna give this a try. We don't talk enough about suffering in the church. And we don't talk about what God's goodness looks like in suffering. And so that's the question I'm going to answer first. We're given a lot of the times, so I was raised in the church. I actually went to a Christian school from kindergarten to grade 8. And I had the privilege of memorizing lots and lots of scripture in the King James Version. I can probably still recite to you Psalm 23.
So did I,
King
yeah.
James. And it was good that I had that experience, but that's not most people's experience. You go to church once a week. If you're lucky, you get Sunday school, but that only happens once a week. And so you are given a perception of God that is about this thin. Now say you do Bible study as well, so maybe that gets a little thicker. But there are so many things that are competing for our time and for our attention, and I think that's become more true today. And so oftentimes we are given, and then not to mention people's attention span. So I think it used to be about 11 seconds, and I think it's down to 8, that you can ever hold somebody's attention for 8 seconds, which is horrifying, but that's fine. And so when you have this anemic presentation of faith, and then you go into study where you find that the object of your study, which is meant to tell you everything literally, in the sense of the fundamentalist end of that word, of course you have a crisis of faith. But the thing that has happened for me was that in the process of going to seminary, the people of faith gathered around to witness about the faithfulness of God in practice. And then this is why I like the Old Testament, because you see the faithfulness of God through every sort of circumstance, and how people still cling to God even in great difficulty. And the reason why I talk about suffering is because the Old Testament never shies away from suffering. Tomorrow is never promised to us. That's what Ecclesiastes and Job tells us. And yet the story that emerges out of Ecclesiastes is, so we enjoy life, we enjoy the good things, we celebrate and we love our family, and we pursue justice. Not because we're guaranteed anything good in life, but because this is what the good life looks like. That's what the wisdom texts tell us. The other thing about the Old Testament that we miss because of our particular understanding of salvation emerging from a particular interpretation of the New Testament is that salvation isn't just spiritual. And the Black church lives this out well because they understand the Exodus far more than the rest of us do. The Lord rescues us physically, spiritually, and loves us as embodied people. We also miss the conversations about why land is important. And the Old Testament tells us why, because we're in relationship with the land. The reasons why the prophets were so angry was because the marginalized among them were cast out. I think Amos talks about, like, what in the world is happening that someone is enslaved over a pair of sandals? And Ezekiel goes on a rampage about why do people go to the temple and say they worship God, but then do the total opposite. He calls people out on their hypocrisy. And so all of these things, I think, seminary for me, and in greater study of the text, has shown me what it means to follow God. And it means that we are in relationship with one another, we're in relationship with God, we're in relationship with the land. And so I talked about the Deuteronomist a little bit earlier, and Deuteronomy 11 in particular sums up the whole of the Torah. Love your God, love your neighbor, love the stranger, because you were once strangers in Egypt. And love of creation. And so when I hear these things about, like, too much study is going to break your brain, probably, but in other ways. My brain is broken from reading too many languages. But I think that it has deepened my faith, because I have the capacity for ambiguity, because the Old Testament allows for ambiguity. The Old Testament says life doesn't always proceed the way that you think it will, but God is with you. Did that answer your question?
I was just getting into it. All right. This is a good one. We're almost done. We've 2 more. Or 3. If the Old Testament is so much about nation building for Israel, why is there so much negativity around Christian nationalism? Because that's essentially the Old Testament. It's about the story of a nation being created.
Is it though? All right. My first degree is in political science, so I'm a bit nitpicky. Let me begin this way. When we talk about covenant in the Old Testament, first of all, I think the perception of the Old Testament is that God is fickle and God is prone to violence. Is that people's general perception? That's usually people's perception when I'm teaching in classes. But what we miss is that the covenants are not formed that way. Now, there's like two kinds of thought on the covenant, right? There's either a Syrian or Hittite loyalty oath, or there's this thing called the suzerainty covenant, which is between a greater power and a lesser power. So between I don't want to say patron, that comes in the New Testament, but like a ruling authority and the vassals under them. Now, in the covenant that emerges out of Sinai, and then the subsequent portrayals of God in relationship with his people, the covenant that undergirds the Old Testament is that God is the one who holds the covenant. And we, as the people of God, respond to that covenant in obedience. The covenant is never hinged on our obedience. And this is true of priestly texts too. So for instance, when you think about impurity, there's ritual and then there's moral impurity. And in ritual impurity, which is like discharge, or you walked into, like you wore different threads, you mixed the threads by accident, or any number of normal things. The thing that happens there really is about God being really holy, and so therefore there needs to be a mediating presence, which is the temple and the priests, and that's why we have things like, the scapegoat that gets sent to the desert. There's why there's sacrifices and rituals and all those sorts of things. But within the Sinai covenant and all the other covenants, really, God undergirds the relationship, and that picture emerges out of the New Testament too, right? That Jesus is the one that holds our salvation. God is the one who holds our salvation, our well-being. And so then you're like, okay, so what about all the punishment and violence and wrath? My friend likes to talk about something called covenantal breakdown. So it's a breakdown of relationship. Because God loves us and allows us to choose, we can choose into relationship with him, or we can choose out of relationship with him. Now, the choosing out of relationship leads to death. And so when we talk about, what were we talking about? Christian nationalism. When I look at Christian nationalism in its current form, I think we have none of that understanding of God, and it's all about power and how we can retain and keep power. When I see the story of God in the Old Testament and his covenant and the formation of the people of God, it is all about the worship of God, the keeping of covenant with God. And precisely in the keeping of the covenant is to love the stranger, love your neighbor, feed the poor and the widow, do not neglect any member of your society, and take care of the land. I don't see that in modern day Christian nationalism because it has been co-opted. Our Christian terms have been co-opted for a specific political narrative that actually seeks to do people harm.
Continue.
The other thing that comes out of Christian nationalism is that it comes out of this particular reading of the text that emerges out of British imperialism and American imperial ideologies. So those are big words. So part of Britain's mandate for the empire was about civilizing the savage. I don't like any of those words, and I don't, anyways. So it meant that they saw their mandate as like, we are going to govern these people so that they will know God. Well, sorry, British people, that's not how that works. But that gets passed on to the Americans, and the specific American bent of that is that they broke free of the British, and they thought that because of that, and because of they were given so much wealth, consequently. I mean, we can talk about why, like, the reason why the US gets ahead is because they come into World War I so late, and they're just not as devastated as the rest of the Western world, which is a cop-out. Anyway, but the ways in which American ideology paints themselves as exceptional, and along with the ways in which Puritan theology gets interpreted, means that civilizing mandate that they got from the British then becomes, well, if we do this, then we will flourish. Now, I just talked about World War I and the cop-out, right? So some of it is just pure savvy, some of it is just how history goes. But the truth of the matter is that the American economy was built on the back of slaves. The Civil War, sure, we can talk about, they have all this lovely language about it being about abolition, and a lot of it was, but a lot of it also was about the economy. The South fought in the Civil War because the economy was built on slaves. Without slaves, their economy would have crashed and has crashed. And so they had very specific incentives to continue that sort of narrative in order to keep the kind of lifestyle that they wanted. And in the American South, you can see this at the African American History Museum. They have a thing called the Slave Bible. They took out portions of liberation. They took out Exodus. They took out the parts of the Pentateuch where it talks about, and at this point you have to treat slaves like this, and then you have to set them free. If they are your brother, you have to set them free. They took it all out. And so when I think about Christian nationalism and the sorts of ideologies that get blended together to take on this holy crusade, I look at it and I go, how holy is it really? Because who does it serve?
And I would, with my limited knowledge, suggest that Israel's social location was intended to be around the flourishing of the neighbors around it. They didn't always succeed at that. And the church's social location is probably very similar. And it's intended to be about the flourishing of those around it, which is the actual lesson that we can, or one of the lessons we can kind of garner from the Old Testament.
And the truth is that when we're talking geopolitically, the nations of Israel and Judah were always marginal kingdoms. Like, they were, if you ever get a chance to look at a map, they're the through road between major empires like Babylon, Persia, Egypt. They're like Sidon and Tyre are they flourish far more than Israel and Judah ever did, because they just had more natural resources, and then you had the sea peoples, the Philistines, come in and invade them. Like, Israel and Judah are always in marginal positions. They were never in real positions of power.
Which is an interesting picture of even how we see God at work in the world. Wow, we are officially out of time. So I didn't get to most of my questions, but I just want to say thank you for stirring our imagination and our questions, and helping us hopefully to lean more into curiosity as we think about the Old Testament and the church today. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.